Okay, so I thought I would try to follow up some of the discussion that's been going on about death, what I was calling death acceptance. Had some response, and other people, I know Thou Art That put up a video, Philosophy is Learning to Die, and there's been other people shooting videos on the curse of death and that death is evil, and I've seen some videos on immortality technologies and longevity technologies, and I want to maybe just clarify what I mean by death acceptance. Now, first off, I'm not advocating, um, that people be happy about being aware of their own death. I guess what I'm trying to suggest and I've said this in other videos, is that awareness of death is the condition of life's meaningfulness. So I want to first, again, talk about what I mean by death acceptance, and then see if I can give a little bit more clarity here. And I'm going to try to be really brief. First off, it's the awareness that comes with the fact of biological cessation. Now, all organisms die, but I don't know the extent to which other organisms are have it as an ongoing condition of their life, and the degree to which they have the meaningfulness that comes as a result of that awareness. So there is a funny video, I'll put a link down to it, but it's from The Onion on scientists teach gorilla that it will die. And it's funny, brings out the anxiety that comes with death awareness, but it also we can treat life as an object that it not only puts priorities into order, but it sets our life in a kind of humble paradox of being a part of nature that is finite, that is limited, that has boundaries both to its skin and its own odyssey through time, and yet all along through language and forms of communication technology, it's able to open to its own conditions of being, its own what do you say, needed context for its own appearance of self-sufficiency, and ultimately we can reflect upon all that's ever been and all that ever will be, and our connection to that, and we can see ourselves as part of the Big Bang and how we connect to that. And I guess that does seem in some way very paradoxical, that the awareness of death is that it's part of the condition by which the meaningfulness, whereby I can relate myself in my very finitude to all that ever has been and all that will ever be. So when I say I'm talking about death acceptance, I don't mean death of the deathbed. I'm not trying to suggest that you live your life and then finally when you get to the deathbed there will be this disclosure and awareness of the meaningfulness of life. Like, again, so if I say that death or awareness of death is what gives life its meaningfulness, I'm not suggesting that, that suddenly life becomes meaningful as if rendered intelligible upon the deathbed, like, oh, aha, this is the story now being completed. I also don't really mean, although someone could try to see it this way, that it's about near-death experiences, and a person who has a genuine near-death experience or believes they have, or genuinely has lived through the death of a really close other, there can be a radical reappraisal of their own life, their priorities, the things they want to do, the significance they impute to the relationships they have with others. I think that's part of what I'm talking about, but it's really not even that. I also, again, it's not the sheer fact of biological cessation. It's not factical death that we're talking about. It's the awareness of death, that death, because we're able to become aware of ourselves in a unique way through anticipating our own death. And I've heard some people, and again, this is maybe partly to Thou Art That, people talking about Heidegger's notion of death. This is my understanding of it, is that we're thrown into the world in such a way that by the time we come to ourselves, we've always already begun, and we have a kind of historicity to our consciousness itself, such that we've accumulated or acculturated various practices in a non-thematic or a non-explicit way, that only after kind of coming to self-awareness can we begin to interrogate them and critically assess them we're cultural products who come to increasing degrees of self-awareness that then can question that cultural background or those cultural sensibilities. But what Heidegger is going to say is that death allows us to run ahead of ourselves. If I run ahead of myself all the way to my own death, it becomes for him a principle of individuation. That is, I can release myself, what he would call from das Man, or the they self, which is kind of the way that you think of what people think of how anything are, of how anything is sort of in the world. You just sort of think about how things are, is what they would say. But you start to realize when you come to terms with your own death that there are things that other people can't do for you, your death being perhaps the exemplar, but there are many things that if you don't say won't be said. There are many things that if you don't do them won't be done. And you start to realize that you're not substitutable at all with other people. Now, there is a sense in which you're substitutable, at least to the degree that you learn a language, you become a cultural member, and you're categorically a person. So there is some sense in which you just fit into that category. But death is one's own most, and it releases one into a kind of anxiety and a dread, because it's the awareness of death that gives such an intensity to the need for, quotes, self-expression, for registering one's uniqueness, registering that one isn't simply a re-echoing and a recirculating of a collectivist or a tribe-like or a communal value, that it's partly a resonance with that, but it's death awareness that brings, I guess, an intensity of individualist art and individualist kinds of expression. Now, I guess I'll maybe just leave it at this and say that I think someone might argue that if you take the scale of different organisms, and I'm not suggesting that some animals are more evolved or less evolved. Yes, I would grant that different organisms are equally well adapted and evolved to their environmental niche and this sort of stuff. I would still want to suggest that there does seem to be a logical set of different ranges of openness to the environment and the world around them, and that's accomplished through different forms of mediation, of inwardness, and outward manipulation. So if we begin with something like vegetative life just rawly, and vegetative life we're going to talk about as plant life, something like this, I don't know the degree of freedom that plants feel. My guess is they don't feel a lot of freedom. They don't have a lot of anxiety. They don't have to flee from predators who are about to devour them. They don't have to hunt around for food and feel their own relation of hunger in direct response to their own motility in pursuing that out. I don't know if they get tired from having failed to the ability to chase down food or to fail to successfully find it. There are certainly dynamics there related to its experience of the world, but it's inward anxieties and outward relations and contingencies of failure seem to be fairly limited in its experiential range. When you move to higher mammals, particularly when you move through insects, animality, up to higher mammals, have limbic systems, emotional experiences, complex degrees of looking for food, of maybe even constructing forms of strategies or techniques for acquiring food, realizing seasonality of distributions of foods. I mean, all of these kinds of things I think are part of what's going on there. By the time you get to what we're going to call humanity, it seems as if nature itself started to experiment with radical forms of mediation, like what we call self-reflexive decision-making and freedom, which may be partly, certainly it's part of the hands, it's the bodily structure, but it is part of its language. It has communication technologies of various sorts, the kind of reflexivity that comes in as we've grown literate, the various forms of communication technology that have enabled us to reflect upon ourselves and give calendrical sensibilities where we can make decisions in advance and think about decisions before we have to be in the situation where we're going to have to implement those. I think if you see, again, that nature had like an experimental blip there, and it tried to see to what degree it could open a little pocket of itself to self-legislation and autonomy, it it's almost like, the organism was thrashing about and it was a failure. That for the 50,000 years, or I don't know how long we're going to say, maybe more than that, but for some 50,000 years or so, the experiment of autonomy and inwardness and self-conscious reflective life for meaning's sake, like meaning as one of life's odd fruits that came to be released through the human, that it was too bold of an experiment, and now humans are in an attempt to get into some kind of resubmergence into animality. So I see a lot of these immortality technologies, the desire to live forever, the desire to prolong life indefinitely, or even the desire for life eternal. In a kind of odd way, there may be repressed desires to recover the sense of animality that maybe they unconsciously, have lost, or they recognize they've lost. That the blissful existence by way of awareness and immediacy that's, I guess, more local rather than abstract and calendrical and inwardly struggled through. It may be that, the bulk of life is more like a kind of organic automaton, and on the other side of it, on the other blip of humanity, will be cybernetic or positronic or, I guess, artificial automaton, and that strange experiment in nature of humanity, where the quest was about meaning and the kind of meaning that could come from that very paradoxical part of nature. I do think nature is very paradoxical, and we're a place where paradoxes become consciously aware of themselves as paradoxical. And it is a paradox that a finite being, an organism that came out of another organism and has a limited lifespan and will die, and yet with thought, with ideas, through language, is able to contemplate the infinite, to contemplate the eternal, to contemplate the timeless. And the more that I think we're longing for something like a death denial, whether it's by technological means or by religious dogma, there may be a sense of meaning that's being harvested by the religious dogma, where people are trying to deal with the kind of meaning structures that come from awareness of death, and then they draw that into their religious dogma for the sake of meaning. But the people who want to just live forever, or they want the promise to cure death, I think they may actually, in some way, may be longing not so much for no death, as much as longing to not be aware of death, which is a kind of displaced pursuit for the animality that we may, again, subconsciously recognize that we have lost. So those would be some thoughts about death acceptance. Okay, thanks.